Margaret sat by the window, the soft light of the afternoon sun streaming in through the curtains. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes gazed out at the garden that she had tended to for years. The flowers in her garden had bloomed beautifully this season, just as they did every year. But today, she wasn't focused on the colors or the blossoms. Her mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the many years she had lived, the choices she had made, and the stories that had shaped her life. At 83, Margaret had seen her fair share of joy and sorrow. She had loved deeply, lost painfully, and learned countless lessons along the way. But now, as she sat alone in her favorite chair, she found herself thinking not just about the things she had accomplished or the people she had loved. She thought about the moments, the quiet moments, when she had listened to her heart and followed its lead. Margaret had always been someone who listened to others. As a young woman, she had been the one friends and family turned to when they needed advice, comfort, or a listening ear. She had always been quick to offer support, never thinking much of it. But as she grew older, she realized that she had often neglected to listen to her own heart. In the hustle and bustle of life, she had been so focused on others' needs that she hadn't paid attention to the quiet voice within her. It wasn't until Henry, her late husband, passed away that Margaret truly began to hear her own voice. The grief of losing him had forced her to slow down, to take a step back from the busy pace of life, and to really listen. And in the silence, she had found stories that she had carried within her for years, stories that had shaped her and her journey. As she sat in the chair, Margaret thought about the first time she realized the power of listening to her heart. It had been when she was just a young girl, not much older than 16. She had been at a crossroads, trying to decide whether to follow her dreams of becoming an artist or to stay close to home and take care of her family. She had been torn between two paths, unsure of which one was the right choice. It was her mother who had finally given her the advice that would stay with her forever. Margaret Darling and her mother had said one evening, "There are no wrong paths in life. You must follow your heart. Listen to what it tells you, because your heart will always guide you in the right direction." Those words had stayed with Margaret throughout her life, especially in the moments when she felt uncertain or lost. Her heart had always been her compass, guiding her through the highs and lows of life. It had led her to Henry, to their home, to raising children and grandchildren, to building a life full of love and joy. But there were also moments when her heart had led her to difficult decisions, to losses, and to moments of pain. Now, as she sat quietly in her favorite chair, she realized that she had lived a full life, a life that was rich with stories, both joyous and painful. And she wanted to share those stories, to pass them on to the next generation, so that they too could learn from the experiences she had gathered. Margaret had lived through the Great Depression, through wars, through the ups and downs of life that seemed endless at the time. She had seen the world change in ways that she never could have imagined. But through it all, one thing had remained constant: her ability to listen to her heart, the heart that had taught her about love, about sacrifice, about strength, and about finding joy in the little things. She had always believed that life was a series of chapters, each one leading to the next. And now, at the end of her journey, she was beginning to understand that the most important stories were the ones she had kept locked away in her heart. The stories of her own life, the ones that had shaped her into the person she was today. Margaret thought about the years she had spent with Henry, the laughter they had shared, the hardships they had faced together, and the love that had sustained them. There were so many stories between them, stories that only the two of them truly understood. But now that Henry was gone, those stories felt like treasures that needed to be shared so that their legacy would live on. And so Margaret began to write. She picked up a pen and started to jot down the stories she had carried with her for so long. The story of her childhood, the story of falling in love with Henry, the story of becoming a mother and grandmother, the story of all the little moments that had shaped her life. She wrote them down not just for herself, but for her children, her grandchildren, and anyone who might need to hear them. She didn't want her life to be defined by the things she had lost or the mistakes she had made. She wanted her story to be about the love she had given, the lessons she had learned, and the strength she had found in the quiet moments. Her stories were not perfect, but they were hers, and they were worth telling. Margaret knew that the most important thing she could do now was to listen to her heart and to share what she had learned with the world. Because in the end, it was the stories from the heart that mattered most. The stories that connected us all, the stories that taught us how to live, how to love, and how to heal. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the room, Margaret smiled softly. She had lived a good life, a life well lived, and now it was time to share her stories. And in doing so, she knew that her legacy would continue, carried on by the hearts of those who listened. Margaret sat by the fireplace, the crackling of the fire filling the quiet room. The warmth from the flames contrasted with the cool evening air, and as she gazed into the flickering light, memories flooded back. Her life had been a tapestry of love and loss, woven together with moments of joy and sorrow. And it was these moments, these stories, that she cherished the most. She thought back to the first time she had met Henry, her late husband. It was a simple moment, a chance encounter, but Margaret knew from the moment their eyes met that something profound had begun. They had been young, full of dreams and ambitions, and the world seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. Henry had a way of making her feel as if the world could be shaped by their love, and for a while it seemed as though it could. Their love had been a quiet kind of love, steadfast, unassuming but strong. It wasn't filled with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, it was in the small things, the way Henry would make her a cup of tea after a long day, the way he held her hand as they walked through the park, the way they laughed together over simple things. It was a love that grew deeper with each passing year, one that weathered the storms of life and emerged stronger for it. Margaret smiled softly as she remembered their wedding day, a day filled with joy and excitement. She had never been one for grand weddings, but the simplicity of their ceremony felt just right. Surrounded by family and friends, they had exchanged vows, promising to stand by each other for better or worse. Little did they know then how many challenges they would face together, but Margaret was certain of one thing. Her love for Henry was unwavering, and so was his for her. Years passed and they built a life together, raising children, buying a home, and facing the ups and downs of life. Through it all, their love remained the foundation of everything. But as time went on, Margaret began to notice the changes. Henry, once so full of energy and vitality, began to slow down. His once sharp mind started to wander, and his body began to feel the effects of age. Margaret watched as the man she had loved for so many years started to fade in front of her eyes. The years of caring for him were some of the hardest of her life. She had never expected to see Henry like this, fragile, vulnerable, dependent, but she never wavered in her commitment to him. She had promised to be with him through thick and thin, and she would keep that promise. Yet as much as she gave, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion, the frustration, the sadness. It was a burden that sometimes felt too heavy to carry. But she carried it because that's what love required. It required sacrifice, it required patience, and it required strength. And then one day Henry was gone. The man she had shared her life with, the man who had been her partner, her confidant, her best friend. He was no longer there. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, and Margaret found herself lost in the silence that followed his passing. The house that had once been filled with laughter, with the sound of footsteps and voice, now felt empty. Her heart ached, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know how to keep going. It wasn't just the loss of Henry that left a hole in her heart. It was the realization that she had to face the world without him. She had always been part of a pair, always known that he was there beside her. But now she was alone. Margaret had always been independent, but the weight of her loneliness was something she had never prepared for. The house felt too big, the days too long, and the nights too quiet. But even in the midst of her sorrow, Margaret found a glimmer of something that had been with her all along. The love she had shared with Henry. It wasn't gone. It had become a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. And as much as she missed him, she knew that their love had not ended with his passing. It had simply transformed, becoming something that lived on in her memories, in her heart, and in the lessons they had learned together. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the fire soothe her. She had learned something important in the years since Henry's passing. She had learned that love didn't end with death. It didn't disappear when someone left this world. Love was eternal. It was a thread that connected her to Henry, to her children, and to everyone who had touched her life. It was a part of her, woven into the very essence of who she was. She smiled as she remembered the good times, the vacations, the quiet nights spent talking, the simple moments that had made up their life. Those memories were treasures, and she carried them with her, always. They were her heart stories, the stories that made her who she was. And now Margaret had learned to find peace in the quiet, to find comfort in the love she had shared, and to honor the memory of Henry by living a life that reflected the values they had built together. She didn't need grand gestures or elaborate displays of affection. She had everything she needed in the love they had shared and in the stories of their life together. Margaret knew that love, no matter how long it lasted, was always worth it. It was the greatest gift of all, the one thing that transcended time, that lived on long after the person had gone. And as long as she had the stories, the memories, and the love in her heart, Henry would never truly be gone. As Margaret sat by the fire, she reflected on her life, on the love she had given and received, and on the lessons she had learned. The stories of love and loss were the ones that mattered most. They were the stories that shaped her, that made her who she was, and that would continue to guide her as she moved forward. Family. For Margaret, the word had always held a deep, unspoken meaning. It was the foundation of everything she had built her life around. Her family had been her rock, her source of love, support, and strength. Through all the joys and sorrows, family was the constant. It was the thread that wove together the fabric of her existence, and it had been the source of many of the stories she cherished most. Margaret had always believed in the power of family, in the way that blood ties could form bonds stronger than anything else. Her own childhood had been filled with warmth, laughter, and the love of her parents. They had been a tight-knit family, bound by shared values and a deep commitment to one another. Even when times were hard, her parents had always been there for her, showing her the importance of family, of sticking together, and of being there for each other no matter what. When Margaret met Henry, she knew that she had found someone who shared her belief in the importance of family. Henry had come from a large family himself, and though his childhood had been filled with its own set of challenges, he had always known the value of a close-knit family. They had talked for hours about their hopes and dreams, about the kind of family they wanted to create together. They had envisioned a life filled with love, laughter, and the simple joys that came with being surrounded by family. When they had children, their vision of family became a reality. Margaret and Henry had poured everything into raising their children, teaching them the values that had been passed down to them from their own parents. The laughter of their children filled their home, and Margaret had always felt a sense of pride in the family they had created. But family wasn't always easy. Like any family, they had faced their challenges. There had been moments of tension, misunderstandings, and disagreements. But through it all, Margaret and Henry had remained committed to each other and to their children. They had worked through the difficult times together, always reminding each other that family was worth fighting for. Margaret remembered one particular evening when their youngest, Emily, had been going through a difficult time. She was a teenager struggling to find her place in the world, and she had been rebelling against the values Margaret and Henry had tried to instill in her. There had been tears, angry words, and a lot of frustration. Margaret had felt like she was losing her daughter, that the bond they had shared was slipping away. But Henry, ever the patient one, had reminded her that family was about patience and understanding. "She's growing up, Margaret," he had said softly. "We need to let her find her own way. She'll come back to us when she's ready." And he had been right. It had taken time, but Emily had eventually come to understand the lessons they had tried to teach her. She had returned to the family fold, and the bond between them had grown even stronger. As the years passed, Margaret's children grew older, moved away, and started families of their own. Margaret had always been proud of the people they had become. They had all grown into kind, compassionate adults, and though they had their own lives now, the love they shared with Margaret and Henry remained unchanged. When Henry passed away, it was a blow that Margaret had never fully prepared for. The world felt a little colder without him by her side, but in the days that followed, she found comfort in the love of her children and the memories they had shared as a family. They surrounded her with care and support, reminding her that she wasn't alone. They were her family, and they would always be there for her, just as she had always been there for them. Margaret realized that family wasn't just about the people you were related to by blood. It was about the people who cared for you, who supported you through thick and thin, who made you feel loved and valued. Her children, her grandchildren, and her friends were all part of her family, and together they formed a network of love that would carry her through the hardest times. One day, as Margaret sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily came to visit. Margaret had always been close to her children, but over the years, Emily had become especially dear to her. They shared a bond that was unspoken, a deep understanding that only mothers and daughters could have. Emily sat down beside her and they watched the sun dip below the horizon in silence. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what you've taught me," Emily said, breaking the silence. "You've always said that family is everything. And I know now more than ever how true that is. No matter where we go in life, no matter what happens, family is the foundation we can always rely on." Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of pride in her daughter's words. "Family is everything, Emily, but it's not just about being there for the good times. It's about sticking together through the tough times too. It's about love, forgiveness, and understanding. And it's about always being there for each other, no matter what. They sat together in silence, the love between them stronger than ever. Margaret had always known that family was the heart of everything, and now she could see that Emily had come to understand that truth as well. As the evening faded into night, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had built a life filled with love, and that love had not only shaped her own journey, but had also been passed on to the next generation. Her family was her legacy, the gift that would continue long after she was gone. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the morning light spilling across the room. A cup of tea sat in front of her, steam rising from the surface as she absent-mindedly stirred it. She had always loved the early mornings, when the world was still quiet and there was a sense of peace in the air. It was during these quiet moments that she often found herself reflecting on her life, the decisions she had made, the sacrifices she had endured, and the ways in which she had grown over the years. As a young woman, Margaret had always dreamed of a life filled with adventure and excitement. She had imagined traveling the world, exploring new places, and experiencing all that life had to offer. But reality, as it often does, had been much different. Instead of traveling, she had stayed close to home, raised children, and built a family with Henry. At first, she had been content with this life. She loved her children and cherished the time they spent together. But as the years went on, Margaret began to feel the weight of the sacrifices she had made. Her own dreams had taken a back seat to the needs of her family. She had put her own desires and ambitions aside in order to care for others. There had been moments when she felt resentful, moments when she longed for more, but she never voiced those feelings. It was her duty to care for her family, to support Henry, to be the mother her children needed. But as Margaret sat there now, looking back on those years, she realized that the sacrifices she had made had shaped her into the person she was today. She had given up certain things, yes, but in return, she had gained something much more valuable. The love of her family, the joy of raising children, and the deep fulfillment that came from nurturing others. Of course, it hadn't always been easy. There had been times when Margaret had felt overwhelmed by the demands of family life. There had been sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and moments when she wasn't sure if she could keep going. But through it all, she had persevered. She had learned to find strength in the love she shared with her family and in the quiet moments when she could reflect on what truly mattered. There had been sacrifices that were harder to make, though. Margaret thought about the times she had to put her own dreams on hold, the times when she had chosen the needs of others over her own. There were days when she wondered what her life would have been like if she had chosen a different path. Would she have been happier if she had pursued a career? Would she have traveled the world, seen the places she had always dreamed of visiting? But in the end, Margaret knew that her sacrifices were not in vain. The love she had given, the care she had provided, had shaped her family and had made her life meaningful. She had chosen to invest in her family, to put them first, and that choice had brought her a sense of fulfillment that she couldn't have found anywhere else. Margaret's thoughts shifted to her children. As they grew older and started families of their own, Margaret had realized that the sacrifices she had made had not been in vain. Her children had grown into responsible, loving adults, and now they were passing on the lessons she had taught them to their own children. The cycle of love and sacrifice continued, and Margaret was grateful for the chance to be part of it. There had also been sacrifices in her marriage to Henry. Marriage, as Margaret had come to understand, was not always easy. It was a partnership built on love, but also on compromise. There had been times when she had had to let go of her own desires for the sake of their family. She had given up career opportunities, dreams of travel, and even small pleasures in order to create a home that was stable and full of love for their children. But Henry had also made sacrifices. Margaret thought back to the times when Henry had worked long hours to provide for the family, when he had set aside his own interests to support her dreams. It had been a partnership of give and take, and together they had built a life that was rich with love and fulfillment. As Margaret sat there contemplating the sacrifices she had made, she also thought about the growth that had come from those sacrifices. She had grown as a person, as a mother, and as a wife. Every decision, every choice had shaped her into the woman she was today. The challenges she had faced had made her stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate. She had learned to navigate life's ups and downs, to find peace in the chaos, and to cherish the quiet moments when everything slowed down. Now, as she looked at her life from the perspective of the years that had passed, Margaret understood that growth was not just about achieving success or accomplishing goals. It was about learning to adapt, to accept change, and to find meaning in every moment. It was about learning from the sacrifices she had made and using those lessons to become a better person. Margaret smiled softly, realizing that the sacrifices she had made, though difficult at times, had ultimately led to a life well lived. She had given of herself, and in return, she had been blessed with a family that loved her, memories that would last a lifetime, and a deep sense of peace in knowing that she had lived her life with purpose. Her journey wasn't over, though. Margaret knew that there would be more challenges to face, more sacrifices to make. But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. The growth she had experienced over the years had prepared her for whatever the future held. She had learned to trust herself, to trust the process, and to trust that everything she had been through had made her who she was. As Margaret stood up and walked toward the window, she looked out at the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. She thought about the lessons she had learned, the sacrifices she had made, and the growth she had experienced. It had all been worth it, and as she stood there, watching the sun set on another beautiful day, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had lived and the person she had become. Margaret sat in the quiet corner of her living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls. The warmth from the fire was comforting, but her thoughts were far from the present moment. She was reflecting on the many things she had learned over the years, especially the lessons that life had taught her about forgiveness and healing. Forgiveness had never been easy for Margaret. She had always been someone who valued loyalty, honesty, and trust. When those values were betrayed, it felt like a deep wound that was hard to heal. Her heart had been broken more than once, and each time it had left scars that seemed impossible to erase. But as she sat there now, looking back on her life, Margaret realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the pain others caused her. It was also about healing herself. Holding on to anger and resentment had only kept her bound to the past, trapped in emotions that prevented her from moving forward. She had learned that in order to heal, she had to forgive, not just for the sake of others, but for her own peace of mind. The first time Margaret truly understood the power of forgiveness was when her father passed away. Her relationship with him had always been strained, and there were many unresolved issues between them. He had been distant, emotionally unavailable, and had never been the kind of father she had hoped for. There were so many times when she had wished for his approval, his love, but it was never forthcoming. When her father died, Margaret felt a mixture of sadness and relief. There was sorrow, of course, because he was still her father, and his passing marked the end of a chapter in her life. But there was also relief because, in many ways, she had felt burdened by the unresolved anger she had carried for years. She had spent so much time wishing for a different kind of relationship with him, but the reality was that it would never be. It was in the weeks following his death that Margaret came to realize something profound. She could either continue to carry that anger with her for the rest of her life, or she could choose to forgive him, not for his sake, but for hers. She could choose to let go of the resentment and the hurt, and in doing so, free herself from the chains of the past. Forgiveness didn't come easily. There were moments when the pain would resurface and she would feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but each time that happened, Margaret would take a deep breath and remind herself that forgiveness was a choice to heal, to move on, and to find peace. Margaret's journey of forgiveness wasn't limited to her father. It extended to many other relationships in her life, including her marriage to Henry. Like all marriages, theirs had been filled with moments of joy and love, but also with struggles and misunderstandings. There were times when Margaret had felt hurt by Henry's actions, times when she had felt unsupported or misunderstood. But over the years, she had come to understand that no one was perfect. Henry had his flaws just as she had hers. It wasn't until Henry became ill that Margaret truly understood the depth of their relationship. As he grew weaker, she found herself caring for him in ways that went beyond the surface. She realized that all the petty grievances, all the small hurts, no longer mattered. What mattered was the love they had shared, the life they had built together, and the memories they had created. Margaret knew that forgiving each other for the small things, for the misunderstandings and the miscommunications, was the key to moving forward together. In those final years, as Henry's health declined, Margaret learned the true meaning of unconditional love. She had always loved him, but now, as she cared for him in his frailty, she learned what it meant to love without expectation, without conditions. It was a love that transcended the little mistakes they had made, the arguments they had had, and the differences they had once struggled with. Margaret had forgiven him for the past, and in doing so, she had found a deeper connection to him, one that transcended all the obstacles they had faced. When Henry passed away, Margaret was left with a sense of peace that she had never expected. She had mourned his loss, of course, but she also knew that their love had been real and that they had given each other the gift of forgiveness. It was a gift that allowed them to live their final years together in harmony with no regrets. The process of forgiveness had been one of the most difficult and transformative experiences of Margaret's life. It had required her to face the pain of the past, to confront the hurt and the betrayal, and to choose to let it go. But in doing so, she had found a sense of healing, a sense of peace that she hadn't known was possible. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't just about forgetting. It was about freeing yourself from the hold of the past and allowing yourself to heal. Now, as Margaret sat in her quiet home, reflecting on the lessons she had learned, she realized that forgiveness was not a one-time event. It was a continuous process, one that she would have to practice for the rest of her life. But she was at peace with that. She knew that each day brought an opportunity to forgive, to let go of past hurts, and to move forward with an open heart. Margaret had learned that healing was not just about letting go of the past. It was about embracing the present and the future with love, compassion, and understanding. She had found the courage to forgive, not just for others, but for herself. And in doing so, she had opened her heart to a life filled with peace and grace. As she stood up from the chair, Margaret looked out the window where the sun was setting over the horizon. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the evening air fill her lungs. She was at peace. She had forgiven, and now she could heal. As Margaret sat in her favorite chair, her hands resting on her lap, she found herself reflecting on the many blessings she had received over the years. Life had not always been easy, but it had been rich with love, friendship, and experiences that had shaped her into the person she was today. She had come to realize that the key to a fulfilling life was not just about receiving, but about giving. Giving of herself, of her time, and of her heart. And Margaret had always been someone who enjoyed helping others. Throughout her life, she had found joy in serving her family, her friends, and even strangers. She had volunteered at local charities, helped neighbors in need, and always made herself available to lend a hand. But as she grew older, she began to realize that giving wasn't just about doing things for others. It was about being present, about offering her heart and her attention in ways that made a difference. She had always believed in the power of kindness, but over the years, she had come to see just how profound its impact could be. When she volunteered at the local shelter, helping to provide meals for those in need, Margaret saw the faces of those who were struggling, and she realized how little it took to make a difference. A smile, a kind word, a small gesture. These were the things that brought light into the lives of others, even in the darkest of times. Margaret remembered a particular day when she had met a young woman at the shelter. The woman had been quiet, withdrawn, and clearly carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Margaret had offered her a warm meal and a kind word, and to her surprise, the woman had opened up to her. She shared her story of hardship, of loss, and of how she had felt alone in the world. Margaret had listened, offering her compassion and understanding. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes all someone needed was to be seen, to be heard, and to be cared for. She didn't have all the answers, but she could offer her presence, her kindness, and her support. That was enough. As the years passed, Margaret continued to give, whether it was through her volunteer work, her time spent with family, or her willingness to offer help to those in need. But as she did so, she also learned the importance of self-care. She realized that in order to give fully, she had to first nurture herself. She had to take time to rest, to recharge, and to reflect on the blessings in her life. Margaret had always been a giving person, but now she understood that giving was not just about giving to others. It was also about giving to herself, about acknowledging her own needs, her own worth, and her own emotions. It was about finding a balance between giving and receiving, between offering her love and care to others and taking the time to nurture her own spirit. Gratitude had become a central theme in Margaret's life. She had always been grateful for the love she had received, but as she grew older, her sense of gratitude deepened. She had come to appreciate the simple things, like the sound of birds chirping in the morning, the smell of fresh flowers in the garden, and the quiet moments spent with loved ones. One of the most profound moments of gratitude came when her daughter Emily visited her one afternoon. They sat together in the garden, surrounded by the flowers that Margaret had so lovingly tended to. Emily looked at her mother with admiration and said, "Mom, I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate everything you've done for me and for this family. You've always been there for us, always giving, always caring. I hope I can be as giving and loving as you have been." Margaret's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to Emily's words. She had never sought recognition for the things she did, but hearing those words from her daughter filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. She realized that her acts of kindness, her selfless love, had been passed down to her children, and that they were now carrying those values forward. I've always believed that the best way to show love is through action, Emily, Margaret replied softly. And I've always felt that giving, whether it's time, love, or support, brings more joy than anything else. But the most important thing is gratitude, being thankful for what we have, for the people we love, and for the lessons we've learned along the way. Emily smiled, and Margaret could see the love and appreciation in her eyes. It was in that moment that Margaret understood the true power of gratitude. It wasn't just about acknowledging the good things in life. It was about embracing the challenges, the pain, and the growth that came with them. Gratitude was about recognizing the beauty in every moment, even the difficult ones, and finding peace in knowing that life, with all its ups and downs, was a gift. As Margaret sat in the garden, surrounded by the people she loved, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had experienced. Her life had been full of challenges, but it had also been rich with love, laughter, and meaningful connections. She had learned that the true heart of giving was not in the grand gestures, but in the small acts of kindness and love that we offer to others every day. And she had learned that the heart of gratitude was in recognizing the beauty of life, even in its simplest moments. Margaret had lived a life of purpose, one filled with love, giving, and gratitude. She knew that these were the things that mattered most, and she had found peace in knowing that her life had been well lived. She had given all that she could, and in return, she had received more than she could ever have imagined. The love of her family, the appreciation of those she had helped, and the knowledge that her life had made a difference. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the garden, Margaret smiled softly to herself. She had lived a life that was full, meaningful, and rich in love. And as she watched the stars begin to appear in the evening sky, she knew that her journey was far from over. There was still so much more to give, so much more to be grateful for, and so much more love to share. As Margaret sat on her favorite chair by the window, watching the soft light of the afternoon filter through the curtains, she thought about the legacy she was leaving behind. The garden outside, the house that had been home to her family for so many years. The photos on the walls. These were the tangible reminders of the life she had lived. But Margaret knew that her true legacy was not in the things she had collected or the places she had been. Her legacy was in the love she had given, the lessons she had taught, and the stories she had shared. Throughout her life, Margaret had always believed in the importance of family, of connection, and of love. It was these values that had shaped her and had been passed down to her children, grandchildren, and even her great-grandchildren. She had always tried to live with kindness and integrity, and it was these qualities that she hoped would be remembered long after she was gone. Her children, Emily and Thomas, were the living testament to her legacy. They had both grown into kind, compassionate adults who had created families of their own. Margaret was proud of the people they had become, and she knew that they had inherited the values she had instilled in them. As a mother, she had always tried to teach them the importance of love, respect, and perseverance. She had shown them, through her actions and words, that family was everything, that love was the most powerful force in the world. But Margaret also knew that her legacy was not just about the love she had given to her own children. It was about the love she had shared with the people who had come into her life. She had always been someone who made room for others, who opened her heart to those in need. Whether it was a friend going through a tough time or a neighbor in need of support, Margaret had always been there to offer a listening ear, a helping hand, or a kind word. And it was this love that she hoped would continue long after she was gone. Margaret had lived her life with the belief that love was the greatest gift one could give, and that it was through love that true change could be made. Her greatest hope was that her children, grandchildren, and anyone who had crossed her path would continue to carry the lessons of love and kindness forward. Margaret smiled as she thought about her grandchildren. They were growing up in a world that was so different from the one she had known, a world that was constantly changing. But Margaret had no doubt that they would carry the lessons of love with them. She had seen how they treated each other, how they cared for one another, and how they showed kindness to others. It filled her heart with pride to know that they were growing up with the same values she had tried to instill in her own children. One afternoon, Emily and Thomas brought their children over to visit Margaret. As she sat in her chair, watching her grandchildren play in the yard, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The love she had given had been passed on, and it was now flourishing in the next generation. Her family was her legacy, and as she looked at her grandchildren's faces, she knew that she had made a difference in their lives. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what you've taught me," Emily said, sitting down beside her. "You've always shown us that love is the most important thing. That family is everything. And I want to make sure I pass that on to my kids, just like you did for me." Margaret's heart swelled with love as she looked at her daughter. "Emily, that's all I've ever wanted, to pass on the love that I've been given, to make sure that our family stays strong and close. It's not about the things we have or the things we accomplish. It's about the love we share." As they sat together, Emily shared her thoughts about raising her own children and the challenges she faced in balancing everything. Margaret listened, offering her wisdom and encouragement. She knew that the road ahead for Emily and Thomas wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew that they had the strength to face whatever came their way. After all, they had learned from the best. In that moment, Margaret felt a sense of peace. She had done her part. She had raised her children with love. She had taught them the importance of family, and she had shown them that no matter what life threw their way, love would always be the answer. She had lived a full life, and now she could rest easy knowing that her legacy would continue through the generations to come. As Margaret looked around the room, she thought about the things she would leave behind. The photos, the memories, the little treasures that told the story of her life. But the most important thing she would leave behind, she knew, was the love that had shaped her journey. That love would live on in her children, her grandchildren, and everyone she had touched along the way. It was the greatest legacy she could leave. Margaret had always believed that life was not just about the moments we lived, but about the impact we had on the lives of others. It was about the love we gave, the lessons we taught, and the way we made others feel. She had made a difference in the lives of those she loved, and that was the most meaningful legacy of all. As the evening came to a close, Margaret sat back in her chair, content and at peace. She knew that her journey was nearing its end, but she also knew that her story would live on in the hearts of those who loved her. And that, she thought with a smile, was the greatest gift of all. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, the warmth of the afternoon sun still lingering in the room. She had always loved the quiet moments when the world seemed to slow down, when the hustle and bustle of daily life faded away, leaving only the gentle hum of life around her. It was in these moments of stillness that she found clarity, the clarity to reflect on her life, on the choices she had made, and on the lessons she had learned. At 83 years old, Margaret had seen much of life. She had experienced love, loss, joy, and heartache. She had built a family, raised children, and made sacrifices. She had lived through decades of change, both in the world around her and within herself. And now, as she sat quietly, looking out the window at the garden she had spent so many years tending to, she found herself reflecting on the journey she had taken. There were times in her life when she had felt overwhelmed by the weight of everything, the responsibilities, the expectations, the demands. But looking back now, she saw those moments in a different light. What had once seemed like burdens were now memories of growth, of resilience, and of love. Margaret had learned that life was not about avoiding hardship, but about facing it with grace and strength. It was about embracing the challenges that came her way, knowing that each one brought with it the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become stronger. As she reflected, Margaret thought about the many people who had come into her life, her family, her friends, her community. She had been blessed with an abundance of love, and she was deeply grateful for the relationships that had shaped her. Her children, her grandchildren, and even her great-grandchildren were the light of her life, and she took great pride in knowing that she had played a part in shaping their lives. Her family was her greatest gift, and the love they shared was the greatest legacy she could leave behind. But it wasn't just her family that had made a difference in her life. Margaret had always believed in the importance of connection, of community. She had spent her life building relationships, not just with those she was related to by blood, but with those who had crossed her path. It was through these connections that Margaret had found strength, comfort, and joy. The kindness of friends, the support of neighbors, and the love of strangers had all played a part in shaping her journey. Margaret also thought about the challenges she had faced, the losses she had endured, and the times when she had felt lost or alone. There had been moments when she had questioned the purpose of it all, moments when the pain seemed too much to bear. But even in those dark moments, she had never lost hope. She had always believed that there was light at the end of the tunnel, that every hardship was an opportunity for growth, and that every tear shed was a step toward healing. One of the greatest lessons Margaret had learned over the years was the importance of acceptance. She had learned to accept herself, flaws and all. She had learned to accept the things she could not change, and to find peace in letting go of the things that were beyond her control. This acceptance had brought her a sense of peace, a calmness in the face of uncertainty. It had allowed her to move forward with grace, knowing that life was not perfect, but it was beautiful in its imperfection. As she sat there, Margaret realized that peace was not something that could be sought out externally. It wasn't found in material possessions or in the approval of others. Peace came from within, from the quiet acceptance of who we were and where we were in life. It came from the understanding that we had done our best, that we had loved deeply, and that we had made a difference in the world around us. Margaret had spent her life chasing after success, after accomplishments, after recognition. But as she grew older, she realized that none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments of peace. The times when she had shared a quiet conversation with a loved one, the moments when she had watched her children grow, the evenings spent with Henry by her side. These were the moments that had truly mattered. In the stillness of the room, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. It was a peace that came from knowing that she had lived a full life, that she had loved deeply, and that she had made a difference in the lives of those around her. It was a peace that came from knowing that her story was not yet over, that there were still more memories to be made, more lessons to be learned, and more love to be shared. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the room, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace wash over her. She had lived a life that was rich with experiences, and she knew that the greatest gift she could give to the world was the wisdom she had gained along the way. She had learned to love without fear, to forgive without hesitation, and to live with gratitude in every moment. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out the window one last time. The stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky, and she felt a deep connection to the universe, to everything that had come before her, and to everything that was yet to come. She was at peace, and in that peace she found joy. Her heart was full, her soul content. Margaret had lived her life with purpose, and now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, looking out at the garden that had been her pride and joy for many years. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over everything it touched. The flowers, the trees, and the quiet pathway through the garden. All of it was bathed in the peaceful light of the evening. As she sat there, a sense of calm washed over her. She had lived a full life, one that had been rich with experiences, with love, and with growth. At 83, Margaret had come to understand that life was not just about what we accomplish or how much we do. It was about the legacy we leave behind, the impact we have on the lives of those we love, and the lessons we pass on. She had always believed that the most important thing in life was love. That love was the force that brought people together, that healed wounds, and that gave life its deepest meaning. And now, as she sat in her garden, she reflected on the legacy she had built. For Margaret, legacy wasn't about the material things she had accumulated over the years. It wasn't about the house she had worked so hard to build, the clothes in her closet, or the money in her bank account. Those things would eventually fade, lost to time, but the love she had shared, the lessons she had taught, and the memories she had created, these were the things that would live on, carried forward by her children, her grandchildren, and those who had known her. Margaret's heart swelled with pride when she thought about her children. Emily and Thomas had grown into strong, loving individuals, each of them carrying with them the lessons she and Henry had taught them over the years. They were both parents now, raising their own children, and Margaret could see the love and care they poured into their families. It filled her with a sense of peace to know that the love she had given was being passed on, generation after generation. But her legacy wasn't just about her children. It was about the impact she had had on everyone she had met, the relationships she had nurtured, and the way she had made people feel. Margaret had always believed that love was the most important thing we could give to others. It was the love we showed through our actions, through our words, and through our time. She had spent her life giving that love freely, and in return, she had received more than she could have ever imagined. Now, as Margaret sat in her garden, she thought about the final chapter of her life. She knew that her time was drawing near, that the days left for her on this earth were limited, but she didn't fear the end. She had come to accept it with grace, knowing that her life had been lived with purpose. She had no regrets, only gratitude for the experiences she had had, for the love she had given and received, and for the memories that would remain long after she was gone. Margaret's heart was full. She had lived a life of meaning, a life filled with love, with sacrifice, and with growth. She had faced hardships, yes, but she had never let them define her. She had faced loss, but she had also found healing. And through it all, she had learned the most important lesson of all, that love was the greatest gift we could give, and that it was love that would carry us through even the darkest of times. As Margaret looked out at her family, gathered together in the garden, she knew that her legacy would live on in them. It was in the way Emily and Thomas cared for their children, in the way her grandchildren laughed and played, in the way her friends still kept in touch and remembered her fondly. Her love had touched so many lives, and it was that love that would continue to shape the world long after she was gone. Margaret had always believed that the true measure of a life well lived was not in the things we acquired, but in the relationships we built, the lives we touched, and the love we gave. She had given all of herself to her family, her friends, and her community. And in return, she had received a legacy of love, of memories, and of peace. As the evening drew to a close and the stars began to appear in the sky, Margaret felt a sense of deep peace. She had lived her life fully, with love in her heart and gratitude in her soul. She had no more stories left to tell, no more lessons to teach. But she knew that her story would live on in the hearts of those she had loved and in the generations to come. Margaret smiled softly as she closed her eyes, her heart content. She had lived a good life, a life well lived, and she was at peace. And in that peace, she knew that she had fulfilled her purpose. As Margaret sat in her favorite chair one last time, a gentle silence filled the room. The afternoon light was soft, bathing the room in a golden hue, just as it had done so many times before. The world outside seemed to pause in deference to the quiet peace that had settled around her. Margaret had lived a long, full life, and now, as she reflected on her journey, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life had been filled with love, love for her family, her friends, and even for herself. She had given so much of her heart, and in return, she had received an abundance of love and kindness. She had known hardship, loss, and sacrifice. But she had also known the healing power of love, of forgiveness, and of the strength that came from living a life of purpose. Margaret had spent her years building relationships, creating memories, and passing on the lessons she had learned. Her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren were the living proof of her legacy. They carried with them the values she had instilled in them, the importance of family, of kindness, of resilience. She had always known that her true legacy was not in the material things she had accumulated, but in the love she had shared, the lessons she had imparted, and the example she had set. She had no regrets. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had faced challenges with grace, and she had embraced life with all its complexities. The hardships had been hard, but they had only made her stronger. The good times had been joyous, but they had never defined her. Margaret had always believed that life was not about avoiding pain or hardship, but about how we respond to it. And she had responded with love, with patience, and with gratitude. As the years had passed, Margaret had come to understand that life was not about the destination, but about the journey. It wasn't about the things we accumulate or the achievements we collect. It was about the people we love, the connections we make, and the memories we create along the way. She had learned that life was fleeting and that each moment, each day, was a gift. The end of her journey was near, and while Margaret knew that her time on this earth was coming to an end, she felt no fear. She had lived her life to the fullest, and she had embraced every moment with an open heart. She was at peace, knowing that she had made a difference in the lives of those she loved. Her heart was full, and she was ready for the final rest that awaited her. Her children, Emily and Thomas, came to visit her often in these final days. They sat with her, reminiscing about the past, laughing at old memories, and sharing stories of their own lives. Margaret was grateful for every moment she spent with them, knowing that they would continue the legacy of love she had built. They would carry the lessons she had taught them, and they would pass them on to the next generation. "I'm so proud of you, both of you," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You've made me so proud, and I know you'll continue to share the love and values we've always held dear. Don't forget to pass on the stories. The stories are what matter the most." Emily and Thomas nodded, their eyes glistening with tears. They knew that their mother's wisdom had been the foundation of their lives, and that they would continue to honor her memory by living with the same love, compassion, and gratitude that she had shown them. As Margaret's health began to decline, she found comfort in the presence of her family. They were by her side, holding her hand, offering their love, and telling her how much she meant to them. Margaret felt the warmth of their love surrounding her, and she knew that she had done her part. She had loved with all her heart, and she had passed on the most important lessons life had to offer. In the final days of her life, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a life filled with purpose, and she had made the world a better place by loving and caring for others. She had given of herself freely, and in return, she had received a love that would last beyond her time on this earth. Her family, her friends, and all those whose lives she had touched would carry her legacy forward, just as she had carried the love of her own parents. As Margaret took her final breath, she was surrounded by the people she loved. There was no fear, no regret, just peace. She had lived a life well lived, and now she was ready to rest. The love she had given and received would continue, a legacy that would live on for generations to come. The world would go on without her, but her story, her legacy, would remain forever in the hearts of those who knew her. Margaret had lived a life of love, and that was all that truly mattered. She had shared her heart, and in doing so, she had made a difference.